I don't
I
care
don't care
what
what your
ticket says.
ticket
I'm not
says.
moving.
I'm not moving. Karen Monroe's declaration cut through first class as she dismissed Anthony Walker, who stood holding his boarding pass to seat 2A designer handbag, claiming the armrest. She flipped through a magazine with theatrical indifference while sipping champagne. "Excuse me, you're in my seat," Anthony had said politely, showing his boarding pass. "I was here first," she replied without looking up. At 45, Anthony had experienced this pattern countless times, the assumption he didn't belong. But after building an empire from nothing, he was done accommodating others' comfort at his dignity's expense. As passengers stared and whispered, Karen had no idea who she was really dealing with. The phone call Anthony was about to make would expose exactly how much this airline valued discrimination over their biggest shareholder. What Anthony did next would ground an entire airline and change aviation forever. You won't believe how this story ends. 20 minutes earlier, Anthony Walker had entered JFK Airport Terminal, looking like any other business traveler. His navy suit was well-tailored but not flashy, his leather briefcase worn from years of use. At 45, he had learned to dress down rather than up, to blend in rather than stand out. It was a survival mechanism honed by decades of navigating spaces where his presence was questioned before his qualifications. The gate area bustled with the usual pre-flight energy. Anthony found a quiet corner, opened his laptop, and reviewed quarterly reports while waiting for boarding to begin. Around him, other first-class passengers chatted easily with gate agents, their privilege worn like invisible armor. When boarding commenced, Anthony approached the jet bridge with his usual quiet confidence. The gate agent, a young white man named Brad, took Anthony's boarding pass with a perfunctory smile that faltered as he read the details. "Mr. Walker, you're in seat 2A first class," Brad said, but his tone carried a note of surprise, as if double-checking Anthony's eligibility for such accommodations. "That's correct," Anthony replied simply. Brad scanned the pass twice, his eyes flicking between the document and Anthony's face. "Okay, you're all set," he said finally, though his smile never quite returned. As Anthony walked down the jet bridge, he reflected on how many times he'd witnessed this same dance. The subtle delays, the extra scrutiny, the barely perceptible hesitation that accompanied his presence in spaces others took for granted. Inside the aircraft, flight attendant Jessica greeted passengers with practiced warmth, her smile bright and welcoming for each first-class traveler. But when Anthony approached, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Welcome aboard," she said, though the warmth had drained from her voice like water from a broken glass. Anthony nodded politely and moved toward his seat, unaware that Karen Monroe had already settled into 2A, her designer purse claiming the armrest, her champagne glass catching the cabin light as she surveyed her domain with satisfaction. The first seeds of what would become a catastrophic confrontation had already been planted. "Let me see that boarding pass again," Jessica said, holding out her hand with an authority that seemed to expand in real time. Anthony complied, watching as she examined the document with the intensity of a forensic investigator. Around them, other passengers had begun to take notice. The quiet murmur of first-class conversation had shifted to something more pointed, more focused on the disruption in their midst. "Sir, where exactly did you purchase this ticket?" Jessica asked, her voice carrying across the cabin. The question landed like a slap. Anthony felt his jaw tighten. "Through your airline's website, same as anyone else." "And the payment method?" "I'm sorry? How did you pay for this ticket, sir?" The cabin had gone quiet now. Even the passengers still boarding seemed to slow their pace, drawn by the spectacle unfolding in first class. Anthony could feel their eyes on him, could sense the unspoken questions hanging in the recycled air. "I use my credit card," Anthony said, his voice remaining level despite the fire building in his chest. "Could I see that card, please?" Karen Monroe leaned forward in his seat, her voice dripping with false concern. I've been flying first class with this airline for 20 years. I've never seen such confusion about seating assignments. A man from Seat 1, B. Robert Sterling, according to his loud phone conversation earlier, turned around to add his perspective. Maybe there's been some kind of mix-up with the booking system. These things happen. But Anthony caught the emphasis on these things, the way Sterling's eyes lingered on him with something that went beyond mere curiosity. Jessica returned with Anthony's credit card, but instead of handing it back immediately, she disappeared toward the front of the plane. Anthony could hear her speaking in low tones to someone, another crew member, presumably, though he couldn't make out the words. When she returned, she wasn't alone. David, a younger flight attendant, flanked her like backup arriving at a crime scene. "Sir, we're having some difficulty verifying your ticket information," David said. "Would you mind stepping to the side while we sort this out?" "Step to the side of what?" Anthony asked. "I'm standing next to my assigned seat." "Well, as you can see, that seat is currently occupied by someone who doesn't belong there." The words came out sharper than Anthony intended, but the absurdity of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. He was being asked to prove his right to sit in a seat he'd legally purchased, while the person actually violating airline policy sipped champagne and played victim. Karen gasped dramatically. "I don't appreciate that tone." "Jessica, I'm feeling quite uncomfortable with this situation." Captain Miller emerged from the cockpit like a storm cloud gathering momentum. His silver hair and pressed uniform commanded immediate attention, and his eyes settled on Anthony with the kind of authority that had ended countless disagreements before they began. "Gentlemen, ladies," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "I understand we have a seating situation that needs to be resolved quickly. We have a schedule to maintain." Anthony watched the captain's approach, noting how the man's gaze never wavered from him, never questioned Karen's presence in the disputed seat, never asked her for documentation or proof of purchase. "Sir," Captain Miller addressed Anthony directly, "I'm going to need you to work with us here. My crew has raised some concerns about your ticket verification, and until we can sort this out, I'm going to have to ask you to take a seat in economy." The words hit Anthony like a physical blow. Around him, the first-class cabin erupted in a mixture of satisfied murmurs and shocked whispers. Karen Monroe actually smiled. "Captain, with respect, I have paid for this seat. I have the proper documentation, and I have done nothing to warrant being removed from it," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his core. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but refusing to comply with crew instructions is a federal offense. I don't think either of us wants to involve federal air marshals in this situation." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Anthony could feel the eyes of every passenger in first class boring into him, could sense their judgment, their assumptions, their silent verdicts about who belonged and who didn't. Robert Sterling leaned forward again. "Look, I don't want to get involved, but this gentleman seems quite agitated. Maybe it would be better for everyone if security took a look at this situation." Karen nodded enthusiastically. "I have to agree. His behavior is making me very uncomfortable. I mean, look at him. He's clearly angry about something." "I'm angry," Anthony said quietly, "because I'm being asked to give up a seat I legally purchased to someone who has no right to it, while being treated like a criminal for asking for basic fairness." Jessica stepped forward. "Sir, your attitude is exactly why we're having these concerns. In 20 years of flying, I've never seen someone get so worked up over a simple seating mix-up." "A mix-up?" Anthony's voice rose slightly for the first time. "What exactly is mixed up here?" "I have a valid ticket for Seat 2A. She's sitting in Seat 2A without authorization. The mix-up seems pretty clear to me." Captain Miller's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to relocate voluntarily, or I will have no choice but to call airport security." And let me be clear, if security boards this aircraft, you will be removed entirely, not relocated. Anthony looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the faces staring back at him. Some showed embarrassment, others satisfaction. Most just wanted the uncomfortable situation to end. But not one person had spoken up in his defense. Not one person had questioned why the burden of proof fell entirely on his shoulders. He pulled out his phone and began typing a message to Sarah Williams, Skyline Airways Director of Operations. The message was simple. Flight SL 447 JFK to LAX. Need immediate intervention. Serious discrimination situation unfolding. Then he looked up at Captain Miller and said quietly, "These procedures seem to target very specific individuals, Captain. But do you have any idea who you're really dealing with?" The captain's threat to call security wasn't idle. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the jet bridge entrance, their presence immediately shifting the cabin's energy from uncomfortable tension to genuine alarm. Officer Martinez, a Hispanic man in his 40s, and Officer Johnson, a younger black woman, approached the situation with professional caution. Captain Miller immediately launched into his version of events. "Officers, we have a passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions regarding seating arrangements. He's become increasingly agitated and is disrupting our departure schedule." Anthony watched the officers' faces, noting how Officer Johnson's expression remained carefully neutral, while her partner nodded along with the captain's narrative. "Sir, could you explain your side of this situation?" Officer Martinez asked Anthony. "I purchased a first-class ticket for seat 2A, Anthony began, but Karen Monroe interrupted from her perch in the disputed seat. "Officers, I need to say something here. This man has been increasingly hostile and threatening toward me personally. I'm a Diamond Elite member with this airline, and I've never experienced anything like this. His behavior is frightening." Robert Sterling twisted around in his seat to face the officers. "I can confirm that. The gentleman has been very confrontational. Look, I don't want to make assumptions, but something about this whole situation seems off." The phrase, "seems off," hung in the air like an accusation. Anthony felt his hands clench involuntarily. "What exactly seems off, Mr. Sterling?" Officer Johnson asked, her tone carefully neutral. Sterling hesitated, apparently realizing he'd stepped toward a line he couldn't cross explicitly. "Well, I just mean, you know how these ticket scams work sometimes. People using stolen credit cards, that sort of thing." "Are you suggesting I'm using a stolen credit card?" Anthony asked directly. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that legitimate passengers don't usually get this worked up over what should be a simple administrative issue." Jessica chose that moment to escalate further. "Officers, I should mention that when I tried to verify his payment method, his responses were evasive, and his behavior since then has been increasingly erratic." "Evasive how?" Officer Johnson pressed. "Well, he seemed surprised when I asked normal verification questions. Most first-class passengers are very cooperative when we need to double-check documentation." Anthony felt the familiar burn of racial profiling disguised as standard procedure. "Officer, how often do you ask white passengers to prove their payment method for seats they've already purchased and occupied?" The question created an uncomfortable silence. Captain Miller stepped forward quickly. "Officers, this is exactly the kind of confrontational attitude we're dealing with. The passenger is trying to make this about race when it's simply about following proper procedures." "Proper procedures?" Anthony's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "Tell me, Captain, what's the proper procedure for removing a paying customer from their assigned seat to accommodate someone with no valid claim to it?" Karen Monroe gasped theatrically. "Now he's getting aggressive again!" "I really don't feel safe with him on this aircraft." The situation spiraled rapidly. Other passengers began pulling out phones, some filming, others calling friends to report the drama unfolding around them. The cabin filled with competing narratives and rising voices. "Everyone needs to calm down," Officer Martinez announced, but the damage was already done. What had started as a seating dispute had metastasized into something much larger and more dangerous. Anthony pulled out his phone again, this time calling Marcus Johnson directly. The phone rang once before a familiar voice answered. "Marcus, it's Anthony. I need you to listen carefully. I'm on flight SL447, and I need legal documentation forwarded to airport security immediately." Yes, it's that serious. As Anthony spoke, he watched Captain Miller's face carefully. The man showed no recognition of the name Marcus Johnson, no awareness that he might be dealing with forces beyond his immediate control. When Anthony ended the call, Captain Miller stepped closer. "Sir, unless you end this disruption immediately, these officers will escort you from the aircraft. This is your final warning." Anthony looked around the cabin one more time, at Karen Monroe smugly occupying his seat, at Robert Sterling recording everything on his phone, at Jessica and David standing ready to play victims in whatever narrative emerged from this confrontation. Then he smiled a cold, knowing expression that made several passengers look away. "Captain Miller," he said quietly, "I think you're about to receive a very important phone call." The captain's phone rang exactly 90 seconds later. The shrill ringtone cut through the tense cabin atmosphere like a knife. Captain Miller glanced at the caller ID, and Anthony watched his face change confusion first, then concern, then something approaching alarm. "This is Captain Miller," he answered, stepping slightly away from the crowd but remaining within earshot. "Captain Miller, this is Sarah Williams, Director of Operations for Skyline Airways," came the voice from the other end, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I understand you're currently dealing with a situation involving Mr. Anthony Walker." Captain Miller's face went pale. "Yes, ma'am. We have a passenger who's refusing to follow crew instructions regarding seating arrangements." "Captain," Sarah's voice cut through his explanation like ice, "do you know who Mr. Anthony Walker is?" The question hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Anthony remained perfectly still, watching as recognition began to dawn on faces throughout the first-class cabin. No, ma'am. He's a passenger with what appears to be a ticketing issue. Mr. Anthony Walker is the chairman and CEO of Skyline Airways, Captain Miller. He is the largest individual shareholder in our company. He is your boss, my boss, and the boss of every single person on that aircraft right now. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen Monroe's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the cabin floor. Robert Sterling's phone clattered into his lap. Jessica and David stood frozen like deer in headlights. Officer Johnson's eyebrows rose significantly, while her partner suddenly found the floor very interesting. Captain Miller's hand trembled slightly as he held the phone. "Ma'am, We had no way of knowing." "Captain, the fact that you didn't know who Mr. Walker is doesn't excuse the fact that you've spent the last hour discriminating against a paying passenger based on assumptions about who belongs in first class. Do you understand the gravity of what you've just done?" Anthony finally stood up from where he'd been leaning against the galley wall, his movement causing every eye in the cabin to track toward him. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that transformed the very air around him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Anthony said, addressing the cabin, "I am Anthony Walker, Chairman and CEO of Skyline Airways. For the past hour, I have watched my own employees and passengers demonstrate exactly how a black man is treated when he attempts to claim a seat he has legally purchased." The transformation was immediate and complete. Karen Monroe scrambled out of seat 2A as if it had caught fire. Robert Sterling deleted the video he'd been recording with shaking fingers. Jessica and David looked like they might actually faint. "Mr. Walker," Captain Miller stammered, "Sir, I had no idea you were—" "The problem, Captain Miller, is that your treatment of me had nothing to do with who I am. It had everything to do with what I look like, and that tells me exactly how you would treat any other black passenger in the same situation." Anthony walked calmly to seat 2A, his seat, and sat down for the first time since boarding the aircraft. Around him, the first-class cabin had become a tableau of shock, embarrassment, and dawning horror, as passengers and crew alike realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. Officer Johnson stepped forward. "Mr. Walker, on behalf of airport security, I want to apologize for any—" Anthony raised his hand gently. "Officer Johnson, you and your partner conducted yourselves professionally. This situation was created by others." He then looked directly at Karen Monroe, who was now standing in the aisle, clutching her purse like a life preserver. "Ms. Monroe, I believe you need to find your actual assigned seat now." Anthony opened his laptop with deliberate calm, the quiet click of the machine powering up somehow more ominous than any shout could have been. Around him, the first-class cabin had devolved into barely controlled panic as the full implications of the situation became clear. His first call was to Marcus Johnson, Skyline Airways General Counsel. "Marcus, I need you to initiate immediate disciplinary proceedings. Captain Miller, flight attendants Jessica and David, full documentation of everything that occurred here today?" Captain Miller stepped forward desperately. "Mr. Walker, sir, please, I was just following standard procedures." Anthony looked up from his laptop, his gaze cutting through the captain's excuses like a laser. "Captain Miller, what you followed were your personal biases. Standard procedure doesn't involve demanding payment verification from passengers who have already cleared TSA and gate security. Standard procedure doesn't involve threatening federal charges against someone asking for their purchased seat." His second call was to Sarah Williams. "Sarah, please cancel all elite status privileges for Karen Monroe and Robert Sterling, effective immediately. 2-year suspension from Skyline Airways for both. And I want a formal investigation into our crew training protocols." Karen Monroe, who had been hovering near the galley in a state of shock, suddenly found her voice. "Mr. Walker, please, I didn't know who you were." "I made a mistake." Anthony's response was measured, cold, and final. "Ms. Monroe, your apology only exists because you now know who I am. That tells me exactly how you would treat any other black passenger who couldn't defend themselves the way I can." Robert Sterling attempted damage control from his seat. "Sir, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about my intentions." "Mr. Sterling, I heard your intentions quite clearly. You suggested I was using stolen credit cards. You filmed me being humiliated for your entertainment. You actively participated in creating a hostile environment." There was no misunderstanding. Anthony's phone buzzed with incoming messages from his executive team, all of whom had been monitoring the situation remotely. His response was swift and decisive. Within 20 minutes, the consequences began materializing. Captain Miller received formal termination notice, effective immediately, with a 6-month suspension from commercial aviation pending investigation. His 40-year career had ended in the time it took to send an email. Jessica and David were terminated with mandatory diversity and inclusion training required before they could seek employment with any airline. Their licenses were flagged for review. Karen Monroe discovered that her Diamond Elite status built over 2 decades of flying had evaporated, along with all accumulated miles and privileges. More significantly, her name appeared on a 2-year suspension list that would be honored by partner airlines worldwide. Robert Sterling's corporate travel privileges, funded by his employer's relationship with Skyline Airways, disappeared within the hour. His company's travel coordinator would be receiving a very interesting phone call about their employees' conduct. Anthony made one final call, this one to Skyline Airways' Media Relations Department. "I want a statement released within 2 hours about our zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. And I want it to include specific details about the consequences faced by employees and passengers who violate these standards." The cabin, which an hour ago had been filled with confident voices condemning Anthony's presence, was now silent except for the quiet sobbing of former flight attendant Jessica and the desperate phone calls of passengers trying to undo damage that had already been done. Officer Johnson approached Anthony's seat respectfully. "Mr. Walker, we'll need to file a report about this incident. Would you prefer to handle that before or after your flight?" "After, Officer Johnson. And thank you for maintaining your professionalism throughout this situation. It didn't go unnoticed." As the aircraft finally prepared for departure, nearly 2 hours behind schedule, Anthony looked around the first-class cabin one final time. The seats that had been filled with his accusers now held passengers who couldn't meet his eyes, who understood that their silence in the face of injustice had made them complicit in something they would carry with them forever. As Flight SL-447 reached cruising altitude, Anthony unbuckled his seatbelt and stood to address the first-class cabin. The passengers who remained, those who hadn't been removed or suspended, looked up with expressions ranging from shame to curiosity to genuine remorse. "Ladies and gentlemen," Anthony began, his voice carrying none of the anger from earlier, only a profound sadness mixed with determination. "What happened today wasn't really about me. It was about what happens to black passengers, to any passengers who don't fit certain assumptions when they try to claim space they've paid for." He paused, looking directly at the passengers who had witnessed everything without speaking up. "Every day, millions of people of color face the same discrimination I experienced today. The difference is, they don't have the power to call the CEO because they aren't the CEO. They don't have legal teams standing by because they're teachers, nurses, students, workers just trying to get home." A middle-aged woman in seat 3C, someone who had remained silent during the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Mr. Walker, I want to apologize. I should have said something. I knew what was happening wasn't right." Anthony nodded respectfully. "Thank you for saying that now." But the time to speak up was when it mattered, when your voice could have changed the outcome for someone who didn't have other options. He looked around the cabin, making eye contact with each remaining passenger. "I used my power today not for revenge, but to ensure that what I experienced won't happen to others. That's what power is for, protecting those who can't protect themselves. The employees who lost their jobs today didn't lose them because they made a mistake. They lost them because they revealed a pattern of thinking that makes our skies unsafe for millions of Americans. And the passengers who were suspended? They showed that discrimination isn't just about what you do. It's about what you allow to happen in your presence." Anthony's voice grew stronger, more purposeful. "Every person in this cabin had a choice today. You could stand up for justice, or you could remain comfortable in your silence. Most of you chose comfort. That's a choice you'll have to live with." He began walking slowly through the cabin, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "But here's what I want you to remember. The next time you see someone being treated unfairly because of their race, their accent, their appearance, you'll have another chance to choose. You can speak up, or you can be complicit. There is no neutral ground in matters of human dignity. I've spent my entire career building this airline into something I'm proud of. Today, I learned that we still have work to do. That our policies aren't enough if our people don't understand that respect and fairness aren't customer service tactics, they're moral imperatives." Anthony returned to his seat, but remained standing. "I hope that everyone on this flight crew and passengers alike will remember this day not as the day a CEO got angry, but as the day you learned that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem." The cabin remained quiet as Anthony finally sat down, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the uncomfortable silence of people avoiding conflict, but the contemplative silence of people forced to confront their own choices and their consequences. As the aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles, Anthony stood one final time to address his fellow passengers. This time, his voice carried not anger or disappointment, but a challenge wrapped in hope. "We're about to land in a city that represents dreams and second chances," he said, looking out at the sprawling landscape below. "Each of you will walk off this plane with a choice about what kind of person you want to be going forward." He paused, letting his words settle over the cabin like a benediction. You can choose to be someone who speaks up when others are being treated unfairly. You can choose to examine your own biases and challenge them. You can choose to use whatever power you have, whether it's your voice, your wallet, or your influence, to create a more just world. Anthony's eyes swept the cabin one final time, taking in faces that would remember this flight for the rest of their lives. Or you can choose to remain comfortable in systems that work for you at the expense of others. You can choose silence when action is needed. You can choose to learn nothing from what happened here today. The plane touched down smoothly, and as the seatbelt sign chimed off, Anthony gathered his belongings with unhurried precision. "The question isn't whether you have power," he said as passengers began to stand and collect their items. "The question is whether you'll use the power you have to lift others up or keep them down." As Anthony walked toward the exit, he turned back one final time with a slight smile that held both warmth and steel. "Remember this day. Remember that justice isn't a privilege to be granted, it's a right to be protected. And remember that every single one of you has the power to protect it." He paused in the doorway of the aircraft, his silhouette framed against the bright California sun. "Fly with dignity. Stand with courage. Choose justice." With that, Anthony Walker stepped off the plane and into a world that would be talking about Flight SL-447 for years to come, and into a future where his airline and hopefully the industry itself would never be quite the same. The video footage from Flight SL-447 went viral within 6 hours of landing. Not the shaky phone recordings that Robert Sterling had hastily deleted, but the crystal-clear security footage that Anthony had personally authorized for release. The airline's transparency was unprecedented. Most companies buried such incidents under layers of legal protection and non-disclosure agreements. The footage showed everything: Karen Monroe's dismissive refusal to move, Captain Miller's threatening demeanor, Jessica and David's discriminatory questioning, and most damning of all, the moment when Anthony's identity was revealed and everyone's behavior instantly transformed. The contrast was stark, undeniable, and devastating. CNN picked up the story first. Airline CEO experiences discrimination on his own flight ran as a breaking news banner for 3 straight hours. Anderson Cooper led his evening broadcast with an analysis of the incident, bringing in civil rights experts who praised Anthony's measured response and systematic documentation of the discrimination. Fox News initially tried to frame it as a miscommunication and questioned whether Anthony should have identified himself earlier. That narrative collapsed within hours when legal experts pointed out that revealing one's identity shouldn't be necessary to receive basic human dignity. The network quietly shifted to covering the story as an example of airline training failures. Social media exploded with hashtags: hashtag justice at 30,000 feet, hashtag Seatgate, and hashtag Dignity, first trended worldwide. The Black community embraced Anthony as a hero who had finally held the system accountable in real time. White allies shared the video with captions about their own awakening to everyday racism. Even international media picked up the story as an example of persistent American racial tensions. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source: other passengers who had remained silent during the incident. Margaret Chen, the woman from Seat 3C who had apologized to Anthony during the flight, posted a video on TikTok that garnered 4.2 million views in 2 days. In it, she sat in her car in the LAX parking lot, tears streaming down her face as she recounted her failure to speak up. "I watched a man be humiliated for an hour," she said to her phone camera. "I knew it was wrong. I felt sick to my stomach. But I said nothing because it was easier to be comfortable than courageous. I will never make that choice again." Her video sparked a secondary wave of viral content as people shared their own stories of witnessing discrimination and choosing silence. The conversation evolved from anger about the incident to introspection about complicity and bystander responsibility. Within a week, Skyline Airways' stock price had actually increased by 12%. Investors, rather than fleeing from the controversy, flocked to a company whose CEO had demonstrated both moral leadership and effective crisis management. The airline's transparent handling of the situation, combined with swift action against discrimination, was being hailed as a new model for corporate responsibility. Anthony found himself fielding calls from other CEOs asking for guidance on handling similar situations. Harvard Business School requested permission to develop a case study around the incident. The NAACP invited him to give the keynote address at their annual convention. But the most meaningful response came in a handwritten letter from a 12-year-old girl named Destiny Johnson from Detroit. "Dear Mr. Walker, my mom showed me the video of what happened to you on the airplane. She said that before you, when black people got treated bad on airplanes, they just had to take it because nobody would listen. Thank you for making them listen. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." The letter sat framed on Anthony's desk as a reminder that the hour of humiliation he endured on Flight SL-447 had created ripples that would reach far beyond any boardroom or balance sheet. Meanwhile, the consequences for those who had participated in his humiliation continued to unfold in very public ways. Captain Miller's dismissal had been covered extensively in aviation trade publications, effectively ending any possibility of employment with major airlines. His case became a cautionary tale discussed in flight training programs across the country. Karen Monroe's suspension and loss of elite status had been reported in travel blogs and frequent flyer forums, where the consensus was overwhelmingly supportive of the airline's action. Her attempt to complain to customer service had been leaked and widely mocked online, particularly her demand to speak to Anthony Walker personally to clear up this misunderstanding. Jessica and David had both attempted to sell their stories to tabloid media, but their interviews backfired spectacularly. Their attempts to portray themselves as victims of an angry black man were immediately countered with the security footage showing Anthony's remarkable restraint throughout the ordeal. Robert Sterling faced perhaps the most severe professional consequences. His employer, a prestigious law firm, conducted their own investigation after the video went viral. The firm's partners determined that Sterling's behavior reflected poorly on their commitment to diversity and inclusion. He was quietly asked to resign, with the firm citing conduct inconsistent with our values. The incident also sparked tangible policy changes across the industry. The Department of Transportation announced new guidelines for investigating discrimination complaints against airlines. Congress held hearings on passenger rights and implicit bias in aviation. Other airlines scrambled to update their training programs and complaint procedures. Skyline Airways became the first major carrier to implement real-time discrimination reporting, allowing passengers to immediately flag incidents via the airline's app. The system connected directly to Anthony's office, ensuring that any serious complaint reached executive level within minutes rather than months. 6 months after Flight SL-447, Anthony stood before a packed auditorium at the International Air Transport Association's annual conference. His speech, titled "Dignity at 30,000 Feet, Building Inclusive Skies for All," received a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes. "What happened to me that day happens to travelers of color every single day," he told the audience of airline executives and government officials. "The difference was that I had the power to demand accountability." Our industry's obligation is to ensure that power imbalance never determines who receives basic respect. As he concluded his remarks, Anthony thought about the young girl's letter on his desk, about Margaret Chen's tearful video, about all the passengers who had found their voices because he had refused to surrender his seat. The true measure of success, he realized, wasn't in stock prices or industry awards. It was in the 12-year-old who now believed that justice was possible, in the bystander who would never again choose comfortable silence, in the system that had been forced to confront its own failures, and begin the hard work of change. Flight SL-447 had ended, but its journey toward justice had only just begun.